4 months, 11 countries, 260 million Catholics watching every move. And then quietly, without ceremony, without a press conference, without a single announcement to the global media, Pope Leo XIV made a decision about Cardinal Robert Sarah that no one saw coming. Not the curial officials who had spent years predicting it, not the traditionalist communities who had prayed for it, not even, by most accounts, the Cardinal himself. The world had been watching the throne of Peter for signals, and the signal, when it came, arrived not with a fanfare but with a single appointment letter and an ancient shrine in Brittany. That is where this story begins. Not in Rome, not in the Sistine Chapel, but on a windswept Atlantic coast in northwestern France, at the Basilica of Saint-Anne-d'Auray, where for 400 years pilgrims have knelt before the memory of an apparition, where a Breton peasant farmer named Ivan Nicolazic saw a figure of light and was asked to rebuild what had been destroyed. 400 years later, Pope Leo XIV chose one man to represent him there. And that choice said more about the direction of this pontificate than any document, any encyclical, any formal address could have said. Cardinal Robert Sarah, born in Guinea, West Africa, raised in poverty, formed in iron faith, the man many cardinals had hoped would become pope. The man Pope Francis had pushed aside, removed from his post as prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship, placed in the quiet of emeritus status. The man who, for the 4 months between the death of Pope Francis and the election of Leo XIV, many faithful Catholics held in their prayers, not as a candidate, but as a symbol of everything they feared might be lost forever. And then Leo XIV, who had been elected on the 4th ballot of the conclave of May 2025, a man from Chicago who had spent his life among the Augustinians of Peru. This unexpected pope looked at the calendar, looked at the ancient feast of St. Anne, and made a choice that reverberated through every cathedral and every small traditional Latin Mass community from Brittany to Buenos Aires. He sent Robert Sarah. The appointment came on May 24, 2025. The occasion was the 400th anniversary of the apparitions of St. Anne in the Diocese of Vannes. The shrine of Saint-Anne-d'Auray had become, over the centuries, what locals called the spiritual heart of Breton Catholicism, a place of processions and pilgrimage, of Marian devotion woven into the very language and identity of a people. July 25th and 26th would mark the Grand Pardon, the Great Gathering, what some called the Breton World Youth Day, where thousands of young people between 16 and 30 would come together for worship, concerts, talks, and the kind of fellowship that only happens when faith is not just inherited but chosen. Pope Leo XIV would send Robert Sarah to lead it, to preside over the liturgical celebrations, to celebrate a pontifical mass at 10:30 in the morning on Saturday the 26th inside the Basilica before the faithful of France and beyond. The announcement was received in many quarters with what can only be described as stunned silence, followed quickly by something resembling joy, because it was understood almost immediately that this was not a routine appointment. Emeritus cardinals are not typically sent as special papal envoys to preside over major liturgical celebrations. The Vatican has no shortage of active prefects and dicastery heads who could have been chosen. Leo XIV had reached past all of them, past the entire apparatus of the active Roman Curia, and placed his trust in a man who had been, in the eyes of much of the Catholic world, in a kind of honorable exile. It was, in the quietest possible way, a statement, and the faithful heard it. To understand why, it is necessary to go back a little, to understand who Robert Sarah is, not simply as a curial official, not simply as a cardinal, but as a figure in the imagination of global Catholicism. Robert Sarah was born on June 15, 1945, in Urus, a small village in the Republic of Guinea. His family was poor. His country, after independence, fell to a Marxist dictatorship that openly persecuted the church. Sarah survived it. He was trained in Rome, ordained a priest, consecrated a bishop, and eventually became Archbishop of Conakry, a man who had lived through totalitarianism, who had watched his diocese suffer, and who emerged from it not embittered, but clarified. His faith, forged in fire, had a particular quality to it, what those who knew him described as the stillness of someone who has learned to distinguish between noise and truth. Pope John Paul II brought him to Rome. Pope Benedict XVI made him a cardinal. Pope Francis appointed him prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship in 2014. And for 6 years, Sarah became the most recognizable voice in the global church, calling for what he called the sacred silence of liturgy, for reverence, for what he named the reform of the reform. He wrote books that sold in hundreds of thousands of copies. He gave interviews that circulated in every language. He became, for a certain portion of global Catholicism, not merely a cardinal, but something closer to a teacher. And then came Traditionis Custodes, the motu proprio issued by Pope Francis in July 2021 that severely restricted the traditional Latin Mass, the Mass of centuries, the Mass of saints and martyrs and ordinary faithful who had never known anything else. The document was a turning point. Supporters of the old rite were shaken. Cardinal Sarah, who had long defended the ancient liturgy, who had argued that a rite celebrated for over 1,000 years could not simply be legislated away by administrative decree, was, within months, replaced as prefect of divine worship. He became prefect emeritus. He was 80 years old by the time Leo XIV was elected. The question that hung over the beginning of the new pontificate was a simple one, though its implications were vast. What would Leo XIV do about the traditional Latin Mass, about Traditionis Custodes, about the communities of faithful who had grown up with the ancient rite and felt that their form of worship had been treated not as a treasure, but as a problem to be managed? And what would he do about Robert Sarah? The first signs came gradually, quietly, the way genuine shifts in the church often do. There was no dramatic reversal, no press conference, no formal abrogation of Traditionis Custodes. What there was instead was a series of gestures, each one small by itself, each one unmistakable in context. The appointment of Sarah as special envoy to Santa Anne d'Auray was the first. Then came a September 22nd, 2025. For the first time since Leo XIV's election in May, he received Cardinal Robert Sarah in a private audience at the Apostolic Palace. The Vatican press office confirmed the meeting to reporters, as is customary, without revealing the substance of what was discussed. But the meeting itself was news. It was the first formal private encounter between the newly elected Pope and the Cardinal, who for so many embodied the questions the pontificate would have to answer. The Vatican spokesman, Matteo Bruni, said simply that the contents of the conversation were private, as was usual in such audiences. But Cardinal Sarah, in the days before the meeting, had spoken publicly. He had told the Italian bishop's newspaper, Avvenire, on September 12th, that he was looking with what he called great confidence toward the pontificate of Leo XIV, that he believed the new pope was bringing back, in his words, the indispensable centrality of Christ, that he welcomed what he described as Leo's evangelical awareness, his capacity to communicate that without the Lord nothing is possible, not peace, not the church, not the salvation of souls. These were not the words of a man consigned to the margins. These were the words of a man who was watching carefully and hopefully, and who was beginning to believe that what he had spent a lifetime defending might now find a more generous reception. And then Leo XIV did something that no pope had explicitly done since Traditionis Custodes. He wrote to France. March 2026. The French bishops were gathering for their spring plenary assembly, a meeting in Lourdes, of all places, the city of Bernadette, the city of appearances and healing waters, the city that has always stood as a symbol of what happens when the church listens to the unexpected. The bishops of France were meeting to discuss, among many things, the question of the liturgy, the question of the communities attached to the traditional Latin Mass, the question of what to do with faithful who had, in some dioceses, been treated as a disruption, and who in others had been welcomed with something approaching pastoral warmth. Pope Leo XIV sent a letter through Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, and in that letter he used words that the Catholic world had not heard in official Vatican communications for years. He called it, directly and without hedging, a painful wound within the Church, this division over the celebration of the Mass, the sacrament of unity itself. He urged the bishops to seek what he called concrete solutions, and then came the phrase that echoed far beyond the assembly rooms of Lourdes. He asked the Holy Spirit to inspire in the bishops a generous inclusion of those sincerely attached to the ancient rite in respect for the directions of the Second Vatican Council. Generous inclusion. Not grudging accommodation, not administrative management, generous inclusion. The words landed like a stone in still water. Cardinal Sarah, who had been watching and reading and praying, Cardinal Sarah saw in those words not just a pastoral instruction to France, but a signal to the entire Church. In an interview he gave at the close of the Second Extraordinary Consistory of Leo XIV's pontificate, on June 29, 2026, the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, he said what many had been waiting to hear someone say. What was written to the French bishops, he said, must apply to all bishops, not France alone. Every bishop of the Roman Rite, be more open, be more fatherly, stop creating division for no reason. And then he said something even more striking. He questioned, gently, theologically, but clearly, whether any pope had the authority to suppress a rite celebrated for over 1,600 years. He asked, in language that was careful but unmistakable, whether a ritual that ancient could simply be banned. He pointed to St. Augustine, the great theologian of the Augustinian order, the very order to which Pope Leo XIV himself had given his life. If a rite is a source for theology, Sarah argued, how can access to ancient sources be prohibited? It would be like, he said, prohibiting the study of St. Augustine to those who wish to reflect correctly on grace or the Trinity. He was speaking to the entire Church, and the Pope had given him the ground to stand on. There is a moment in this story that deserves to be slowed down, a moment that captures, perhaps more than any formal document or official statement, what is actually happening between Leo XIV and Robert Sarah, and what it means for the Church. It happened not in a hall of the Vatican, not in front of cameras, not at a consistory or a press conference. It happened at Saint-Anne-d'Auray on July 26, 2025. Cardinal Robert Sarah, 80 years old, the son of a poor family in Guinea, trained in Rome, shaped by persecution and silence and prayer, walked in procession into the ancient basilica in Brittany. He vested for a pontifical mass. He stood before thousands of young Catholics, 16, 17, 18, 20 years old, who had come from across the diocese of Vannes for what was called, with some affection, the Breton World Youth Day. And he celebrated Mass, not a mass of committees and commissions, not a mass of debates and documents, a Mass, the ancient act, the act that Robert Sarah had spent his entire life defending, not as a matter of liturgical taste, but as the living heart of the Church's encounter with God. Pope Leo XIV was not present. He was in Rome, but his envoy was there, his chosen representative. And the faithful who filled that basilica and lined the streets outside understood something that no press release could have communicated, that the new pope did not consider the traditionalist faithful of France, or of anywhere, to be a problem to be solved. He considered them to be a family to be accompanied, and he had sent the man they most trusted to accompany them. A young woman from the Diocese of Vannes, interviewed afterward, was asked what it meant to see Cardinal Sarah there, sent personally by the Pope. She paused for a moment, and then she said only, "We did not think anyone remembered us." That sentence carries a weight that any analysis of curial politics cannot quite touch, because beneath all the theological debates, beneath the questions of motu proprios and liturgical directives and episcopal permissions, beneath all of it, there was a human reality. There were communities of faithful, often small, sometimes isolated, frequently misunderstood, who had felt, in the years of Traditionis Custodes, that their attachment to an ancient form of worship had made them suspect in the eyes of their own Church, who had felt not merely regulated but marginalized, who had read the 2021 document not as a pastoral correction but as a verdict. Cardinal Sarah had never stopped speaking on their behalf. In his September 2025 interview with Avenir, he had said that a rite, by its nature, is not composed at a desk. It is the fruit of theological and cultural stratification and sedimentation, centuries of prayer, of lived faith, of saints and scholars and ordinary believers who had knelt in the same posture before the same mystery. He said he considered the variety of rites in the Catholic world to be a great treasure. He said that over the centuries, this diversity had never posed a problem for authorities, because the unity of faith was clear. And he had said one more thing, quietly, in a passage that received less attention than it deserved. He had expressed reservations about the practice of one pope canceling what had been established by another. The Church, he said, is continuity, not the continuity of bureaucracy, the continuity of faith. One pope should not simply say the opposite of another, not because popes are infallible in their administrative decisions, but because the Church is not a government that changes policy with each election. It is a body that moves through history as a single living thing, receiving and transmitting what it has been given. This was, in some ways, the deepest question embedded in the relationship between Leo XIV and Cardinal Sarah. Not merely, what will happen to the traditional Latin Mass, but what kind of church does Pope Leo XIV intend to lead? One that treats its ancient inheritance as something to be legislated and managed, or one that holds that inheritance with the kind of reverence Sarah had been calling for across decades? The answers so far have not come in the form of dramatic reversals. They have come in the form of appointments and letters and private audiences. They have come in the form of a pope who, in an interview before his election, had said something that none of his colleagues had thought to say publicly, that perhaps the abuse of the Vatican II Mass, celebrated poorly and without reverence, had driven some faithful toward the older form. Not because the older form was superior, but because what they were seeking was encounter with mystery. And that if the newer Mass were celebrated with the dignity it deserved, the difference between the two experiences might not be what the polemicists claimed. Leo XIV had, before he was pope, described the polarization around the liturgy with the kind of plain-spoken sorrow that suggested he had watched it as a pastor, not as a politician. He had not, as pope, resolved it with a single document. But he had done something that some thought equally significant. He had sent Robert Sarah to Brittany. He had received Robert Sarah in a private audience. He had written to the bishops of France asking them to be generous. And in July 2026, Cardinal Sarah, standing before journalists at the close of the Second Extraordinary Consistory, had declared that what Leo XIV had asked of France must apply to the entire world. But before reaching that moment, before the Consistory of June 2026, before the letter to France, before any of the careful gestures that have defined this relationship, there is one more thread that needs to be drawn out. Because the relationship between Leo XIV and Robert Sarah is not only a relationship about liturgy. It is a relationship between two men whose entire lives were shaped by the encounter between faith and power, and who arrived at the same conclusion from very different directions. Robert Sarah grew up under Sékou Touré. The name is not widely remembered outside Africa, but it should be. Touré was the first president of independent Guinea, a Marxist dictator who ruled from 1958 until his death in 1984, and who spent much of that time dismantling the institutions of civil society, including the church. Sarah was ordained in that environment. He was formed as a priest and bishop in a country where faith was treated by the state as a form of subversion, where religious communities were harassed, where the faithful gathered in the knowledge that what they were doing was, in the eyes of the government, an act of defiance. He survived it, more than survived. He emerged from it with a clarity of vision about what the church is and what it is for. The church is not a social institution. It is not a cultural comfort. It is not a community organization that happens to use religious language. It is the body of Christ, present in history, carrying within itself the encounter with the living God. Everything else, every document, every synod, every liturgical directive, every curial appointment is secondary to that. Either the church is what it claims to be, or it is nothing. Sarah spent decades in Guinea learning that truth not from books, but from living it. Leo XIV learned his version of the same truth in Peru. He arrived in Chulucanas in the 1980s. A young Augustinian priest from Chicago dropped into a world of poverty and dust and communities that had almost no institutional support. He spent years in Peru. He became Bishop of Chiclayo. He watched Peruvian Catholicism, earthy, Marian, deeply traditional in the way that popular faith often is, and he absorbed it. He did not try to modernize it or reform it or explain it away. He recognized in it the same thing that Robert Sarah recognized in the faith of Guinea. That genuine faith, lived in the conditions of hardship, has a quality that comfortable faith often lacks. It knows what it needs. It knows what it cannot afford to lose. Two men, two continents, two experiences of what faith looks like when it cannot rely on institutional protection and cultural prestige. When Leo XIV looked at Robert Sarah, he was not only looking at a cardinal with a specific position on the liturgy. He was looking at a man who had learned the same lesson he had learned, that the Church's most essential task is to make God real, not plausible, not manageable, real. This is why the appointment to Saint-Andoré was not simply a diplomatic gesture, it was a recognition. And why the private audience of September 2025 was not simply a courtesy call. It was a conversation between two men who, from opposite ends of the world, had arrived at the same understanding of what is essential and what is peripheral, and who, in the first months of a new pontificate, were slowly mapping the terrain of what they might build together. The question of Traditionis Custodes itself remains formally unresolved. But Cardinal Sarah, in his June 2026 interview, offered something that was, in its way, more interesting than a call for formal abrogation. He suggested that perhaps the question of a document was not the essential one. Perhaps, he said, even without a formal repeal, the restrictive text could disappear little by little, day by day, year by year, not through bureaucratic reversal, but through the gradual restoration of pastoral openness. Let it fade, he said, in his careful way. Leave it and say, continue, and this text will disappear little by little. It was, in its quiet way, a remarkable thing to hear from a cardinal who had spent years calling for the ancient right to be restored to full freedom. He was not, in that moment, demanding a decree. He was describing a process, a living process, the kind of process by which the Church has historically resolved its tensions, not through the dramatic reversal of one authority by another, but through the slow, pastoral accumulation of acts of generosity. And in this, perhaps, lies the deepest significance of the relationship between Pope Leo XIV and Cardinal Robert Sarah, a relationship that has unfolded not in headlines, but in the language of gestures, the language of whom you send to represent you at an ancient shrine, the language of whom you receive first in a private audience, months after your election, the language of the words you choose when you write to the bishops of France, generous inclusion, not grudging management. Pope Leo XIV is a man formed by the Augustinians, the order founded in the name of the Bishop of Hippo, who spent his life writing about the restlessness of the human heart and the peace it finds only in God. Leo's pontificate motto, in illo uno unum, in the one we are one, speaks to a vision of unity that is not uniformity, a unity that holds together ancient and modern, Latin and vernacular, African and American, tradition and renewal, because all of it belongs to the one in whom it is rooted. Robert Sarah is a man formed by poverty and persecution, by the simplicity of a faith that survived dictatorship not because it was sophisticated, but because it was real. He has spent his public life arguing that the Church's liturgy should not be comfortable, should not be entertaining, should not be designed to make the worshiper feel at home in the world. It should make the worshiper feel at home in God. There is a difference, a vast and beautiful and demanding difference. These two men, an American Augustinian who became Pope of Rome and a Guinean cardinal who became the voice of liturgical tradition, have, in the month since May 2025, found a language to speak to each other. It is not yet the language of formal documents or sweeping gestures. It is the language of trust being built quietly in the spaces that the institution allows. There was a moment in Cardinal Sarah's June 2026 interview at the close of the extraordinary consistory that received less attention than it might have. He was asked about synodality, the concept that had shaped much of the later Francis pontificate, the vision of a church that moves forward through listening and discernment and widespread consultation. And Sarah said plainly that it was a term he had never understood. He was not dismissing consultation. He was questioning the concept as it had been deployed, the suggestion that the Church's future lies in processes of dialogue that sometimes seem to float free of the doctrinal and moral certainties that give the Church its identity. He contrasted communion and synodality. Communion, he said, is the end. Synodality is a means to be verified. Communion is hierarchical because that is how Christ wanted his Church to be. Synodality, and here he cited Leo XIV himself, is more of a style, a manner of proceeding, not a destination. He then said something about the study group report on homosexuality, that such a document should not reach the world's dioceses without the personal scrutiny of the Pope himself. He said that what has been done for 1600 years cannot simply be declared no longer valid. He said that the Church of 2050 will still be a light in the world, not because of any human strategy or institutional reform, but because the Church does not belong to men, not to the bishops, not even to the Pope. It belongs to Christ. These are not the words of a man who has been defeated or silenced. They are the words of a man who at 80 years old has found a new context in which to speak, a pontificate that has not perhaps given him everything he might have hoped for, but that has given him something more valuable than a formal victory. It has given him a hearing. The story of Pope Leo XIV and Cardinal Robert Sarah is still being written. No climax has yet arrived. Traditionis custodes remains on the books. The traditional Latin Mass communities of the world continue to watch and wait. The extraordinary consistory of June 2026 took place against a backdrop of ongoing theological and pastoral conversations that will shape the Church for decades. Cardinal Sarah is 80 years old, and the arc of his influence is entering its final chapter. But what has been established in the months since May 2025 is something quieter and perhaps more durable than a formal document. It is a relationship of respect, a relationship in which the new Pope looked at the calendar of the Church's life, looked at the anniversary of an ancient apparition and said, "Send Robert Sarah," in which the new Pope, months into his pontificate, opened the doors of the Apostolic Palace for a first private conversation, in which the new Pope, in a letter to the bishops of France, reached for the word generous rather than the word permitted, the word inclusion rather than the word accommodation. Cardinal Sarah, in his June 2026 interview, said something that has stayed with those who heard it. He was speaking about the liturgy, about the ancient rite, about what he called the theological and cultural sedimentation of centuries of prayer, and he said, "A rite is not composed at a desk. It grows in the life of the faithful. It is sanctified by generations of those who knelt before it in faith and love and need. It cannot be made to disappear by administrative action, any more than a river can be made to stop flowing by a decree. The water finds its way." Perhaps that is the deepest thing to be said about what Pope Leo XIV has done with Cardinal Robert Sarah, and what Cardinal Sarah has done with the opening that Leo has given him. The water is finding its way. Slowly, in the language of gestures and appointments and carefully chosen words. Slowly, in the manner of a church that moves through centuries rather than through news cycles. Slowly, with the kind of patience that faith makes possible. Because in the end, as Cardinal Sarah has said across the length of his public ministry, the Church does not belong to any of us. Not to the curialists who debate its documents, nor to the journalists who analyze its appointments, nor to the cardinals who advise the Pope, nor to the Pope himself. It belongs to Christ. And Christ, as Robert Sarah has said more times than he can count, does not abandon what has been given into his keeping. An ancient rite, a Guinean cardinal, an American Augustinian on the throne of Peter, a basilica in Brittany where pilgrims have knelt for 400 years, and somewhere in that confluence, in the decision to send one man to represent another at a feast of an ancient saint on the Atlantic coast of France, the first quiet notes of something that feels, to those who have been listening for it, very much like hope. That hope does not resolve everything. It does not answer every question. It does not silence every anxiety, but it is real. And in the Church, as in the heart, the presence of hope, even quiet, even incomplete, is not a small thing. It is the beginning of everything. There is a prayer that has been prayed at Saint-Anne-d'Auray for 400 years. It is prayed in Breton, a language that has survived every empire and every republic that has sought to silence it. The pilgrims who come each summer to kneel at the shrine of the Grandmother of Christ, because that is who Saint Anne is, in the tradition of the Church, the grandmother of God made flesh. Those pilgrims have kept that prayer alive through centuries, in which everything around them told them it was finished. It was not finished. It never was. The faith continued, the pilgrims continued, the prayer continued, because these things do not depend on the approval of any government or any curial document. They depend on people who believe, genuinely and without performance, that God is real and that prayer is not a ritual, but a conversation. Pope Leo XIV sent Robert Sarah to preside over that ancient prayer. In that decision, quiet, unexpected, almost unremarked in the headlines of the day, something was restored that many had believed was lost, not fully, not finally, but genuinely. A restoration, like all true restorations, that begins not with a declaration, but with a gesture, with a single appointment letter, with an ancient shrine, with a mass, and the water, as it always does, found its way. For ongoing coverage of Pope Leo XIV's pontificate and its meaning for the global church, subscribing to this channel ensures that none of these developments pass unnoticed. The comment section below is open. What moment in this story, what decision, what word from Leo XIV or Cardinal Sarah landed most powerfully?